History isn't just a record of the past, it's a puzzle filled with secrets, questions, and truths buried on purpose. Welcome to the channel, where we go beyond the surface, challenge the official stories, and uncover the mysteries the world was never supposed to remember. If you love lost civilizations, hidden timelines, ancient technology, and shocking historical evidence, you're exactly where you need to be. Before we begin, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a discovery that could change what we think we know about history. And watch till the end, because the final reveal is always what ties the entire mystery together. The truth doesn't show up in the first minute, it shows up in the last one. Now, let's get into the video. The dawn of divinity and the seeds of conflict. Long before recorded history began, long before the earliest civilizations carved their rudimentary lives into the sands of Mesopotamia, a higher order of beings walked the earth. These were not mortals, nor were they myths in the sense that later generations would understand them. They were the Anunnaki, celestial architects, rulers, and arbiters of earth, whose influence would be etched into the very foundation of human civilization. Their origins are shrouded in cosmic mystery, hidden within tablets and inscriptions that only the boldest scholars dare to interpret. But what remains undeniable is the gravity of their presence and the cataclysmic conflicts that would follow, the Anunnaki Civil War. The Anunnaki, as ancient Sumerian texts describe, were deities who descended from the heavens with purpose. They came not as invaders, but as creators, engineers of the human experience. It is said that they were tasked with mining Earth's resources, particularly gold, to stabilize their distant home planet, Nibiru. The work they undertook on Earth was vast, establishing cities, forging hierarchies, and seeding humanity itself, a species designed to serve them. Yet, even among gods, unity is fragile. The seeds of the Civil War were sown in ambition and ideology. Some Anunnaki believed in dominion through control, a strict hierarchy enforced with fear and strength. Others advocated for a symbiotic approach with humanity, seeing the potential of mankind as partners rather than mere laborers. These ideological rifts, trivial to the untrained eye, festered over centuries into a schism that would erupt into war. It is said that the very heavens watched as brother turned against brother, and as gods clashed over the fate of the world they had shaped. The conflict was not merely philosophical, it was intensely personal. Anu, the chief of the Anunnaki pantheon, sought to maintain order, but his offspring, the warrior Enlil and the strategist Enki, each had divergent views on human stewardship. Enlil, fierce and uncompromising, saw humanity as tools to enforce Anunnaki will. Enki, cunning and mercurial, sympathized with the fragile humans and advocated for their freedom and growth. This divergence sparked heated confrontations, councils filled with divine tension, and ultimately, acts of sabotage that no mortal could ever witness. According to the ancient cuneiform tablets discovered in the ruins of Nippur, the first signs of open hostility emerged during the construction of what would become some of humanity's first monumental cities. These were not ordinary cities, but sprawling hubs of technological and mystical power, reflecting the Anunnaki's advanced understanding of the cosmos. It is written that at Eridu, Enki's favored city, disputes over resources, labor, and the rights of humans erupted into violent clashes with forces loyal to Enlil. The struggle was not merely political, it was cosmic, shaking the Earth's magnetic fields and altering the very climate of early civilization. Floods, earthquakes, and sudden famines coincided suspiciously with the timing of these conflicts, leading some scholars to suggest that the Anunnaki's battles left physical traces on the planet. The conflict escalated with the formation of alliances. Other deities, each with their own followers and vested interests, were drawn into the strife. Nergal, the fierce warrior of destruction, sided with Enlil, seeking to expand his domain through the chaos of war. Ninhursag, a protector of life, allied with Enki, secretly fostering humanity's survival and growth. Each god brought not only followers but technologies, weapons, and strategies far beyond human comprehension. They wielded energy in forms that could vaporize mountains, manipulate weather, and fracture rivers. From the perspective of primitive humans, these were acts of divinity; from the perspective of the Anunnaki, they were tactical maneuvers in a war over ideology, power, and destiny. Yet, even amidst war, there were moments of intrigue, diplomacy, and betrayal. Secret councils convened in hidden temples, where emissaries whispered over maps of human settlements, plotting ambushes or negotiating temporary truces. The Anunnaki were not gods of mindless destruction alone, they were cunning strategists, capable of deception and subtle manipulation. One such episode, described in fragments of the Tablets of Destinies, recounts how Enki feigned a surrender to Enlil, only to reroute critical resources to fortify human refuges, a move that would later tip the balance of key battles. The human dimension of the war, though indirect, was profound. The Anunnaki, despite their godlike status, required human labor and ingenuity. The escalating conflict forced humans to adapt in unprecedented ways. They became builders of fortresses, carriers of supplies, and witnesses to incomprehensible powers. Some were elevated, given knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and the secrets of life itself. Others suffered as collateral in battles that could obliterate entire valleys. From these interactions, the foundations of modern civilization were inadvertently laid. Cities such as Uruk, and Babylon were not merely settlements, they were crucibles forged under the shadow of a divine civil war. What ultimately distinguished this conflict from mortal wars was the scale and the stakes. This was a war that spanned continents, not just armies. The heavens themselves seemed to tremble under its weight. Cosmic phenomena recorded in ancient myths, fiery comets, falling stars, unexplained eclipses, may well have been byproducts of the Anunnaki's arsenal. In addition, the geological record hints at cataclysmic events roughly aligned with this period, suggesting that the civil war was not confined to celestial realms but had tangible, earth-shaking consequences. And yet, despite the devastation, the war was not absolute. Alliances shifted, betrayals altered the course of campaigns, and the line between victor and vanquished blurred. The final outcome would not be determined on a single battlefield but in the intricate weave of politics, power, and the survival of their human proxies. As the war unfolded, it reshaped not only the Anunnaki hierarchy but also the trajectory of human civilization, a legacy hidden in myths, legends, and the enigmatic ruins scattered across Mesopotamia and beyond. This is the dawn of the Anunnaki civil war, a period when gods walked the earth not as distant observers but as combatants, strategists, and rulers locked in an eternal struggle for dominance. It was a war that would leave the planet forever altered, a war that mortals would later interpret as divine punishment or blessing, depending on the storyteller's perspective. And at the heart of this war lay a paradox. In their battle for supremacy, the Anunnaki inadvertently shaped the very species they debated controlling. As Part 1 concludes, we see the stage set for an escalating conflict. Ideologies collide, cities burn, and alliances are forged in secrecy. The tension between Enlil and Enki is not merely a quarrel of gods, it is the prelude to a war that will ripple across millennia, influencing the fate of humanity in ways even the Anunnaki could not fully anticipate. In the chapters to come, we will witness the battles in detail, the strategies that shaped entire civilizations, and the human stories intertwined with divine machinations. We will uncover the hidden weapons of the gods, the betrayals that reshaped their alliances, and the cataclysmic events that scarred the earth, all before the ultimate resolution of this unparalleled celestial conflict. The first clash, fire and blood on the earth. The tranquility of early civilization was shattered as the Anunnaki civil war spilled from secret councils and whispered intrigues into open, violent confrontation. The ideological rift between Enlil and Enki had grown insurmountable. Enlil, the staunch advocate of dominion and strict oversight, mobilized his loyalists with unrelenting fervor. Enki, protector of humanity and cunning strategist, gathered those willing to resist absolute control, creating a coalition not only of gods but of mortals who had begun to glimpse the power they were destined to wield. The first major clash took place near the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, in a region that humans would later call Sumer. Here, the Fertile Crescent became a battleground of divine proportions. Rivers shifted unnaturally, the sky glowed with auroras not known to Earth, and mountains trembled as if the planet itself recoiled from the violent energies unleashed above it. According to fragmented Sumerian texts, this battle was not merely fought with weapons but with elemental forces, storms summoned by the gods, fire hurled from their hands, and energies that could rend the land itself. Mortals witnessing these events described them as apocalypse incarnate. Enlil's forces, known for their martial precision and overwhelming power, struck first. They sought to consolidate control over the labor and cities essential to the Anunnaki's mining operations. The targets were clear: strategic outposts, resource-rich regions, and human settlements aligned with Enki's faction. Enlil believed that domination through fear and force would ensure victory, and his tactics reflected his ruthlessness. Entire cities were uprooted, their structures obliterated in moments by beams of celestial energy. Rivers overflowed as dikes and canals, engineered by humans for irrigation, were shattered by divine might, flooding fields and displacing entire populations. Yet, despite this devastation, Enki's coalition demonstrated the resilience and cunning that would define the civil war. Enki's approach contrasted sharply. While Enlil relied on brute force, Enki employed strategy, deception, and adaptation. Rather than confronting Enlil head-on, he used the terrain, the human settlements, and even the loyalty of neutral Anunnaki to counter the attacks. Enki manipulated rivers, redirecting floods to create natural barriers, while secretly arming humans with knowledge of construction, metallurgy, and early forms of weaponry. This knowledge would later be recorded in myths as gifts from gods: the plow, the wheel, and techniques for metallurgy, but in reality, these were tactical enablers designed to strengthen human allies in the larger divine conflict. The human role in the war quickly became critical. Mortals were not mere observers, they were pawns, soldiers, and sometimes strategists in the Anunnaki campaigns. Some tribes were elevated, granted knowledge and longevity to serve as elite labor forces and tactical units. Others were decimated for their loyalty to the opposing god. The Anunnaki exploited every human settlement as a resource for intelligence, construction, or as bait to lure enemy forces. Stories survive in later mythologies, depicting humans as both victims and collaborators, their fates inseparably linked with the War of the Gods. One of the most infamous early battles occurred at the city of Eridu, Enki's bastion. Here, Enlil's forces advanced with the intention of annihilating the city and capturing its human population for forced labor. According to surviving tablets, Enki deployed an array of defenses both ingenious and terrifying. Rivers were redirected to flood approach routes, and barriers of unknown materials, perhaps precursors to early metallurgy and masonry, deflected blasts of divine energy. Enki himself is said to have engaged in direct combat with Enlil's generals, not with physical weapons but by manipulating energy fields that could bend reality itself. The battle raged for days, leaving scars on both the land and the humans who lived there. Those who survived carried the stories in oral traditions that would become the backbone of Mesopotamian mythology. Amid the chaos, betrayal emerged as a constant companion. Even among the Anunnaki, loyalties were fragile. Ninhursag, goddess of life and protector of humanity, was rumored to have secretly undermined Enlil's supply lines, sending critical intelligence to Enki. Nergal, previously allied with Enlil, began questioning his strategies after witnessing the collateral destruction inflicted upon human populations he had grown to admire. This internal conflict weakened Enlil's coalition in subtle but profound ways, demonstrating that in the War of Gods, ideology could fracture even the strongest armies. The destructive capacity of the Anunnaki was mirrored in the Earth itself. Archaeological and geological records hint at cataclysms coinciding with this era: sudden climate changes, regional flooding, and seismic disturbances. Some researchers suggest that these events may have been the byproducts of Anunnaki weaponry, massive energy discharges capable of reshaping landscapes, redirecting rivers, and altering ecosystems. The Anunnaki's battles were not contained; the planet itself bore the imprint of their conflict, leaving future civilizations to inherit both the benefits of their knowledge and the scars of their war. Even as battles raged, diplomacy was not abandoned. Secret councils continued, where emissaries attempted to negotiate temporary truces or exchanges of territory. These meetings were fraught with tension; spies and double agents were a constant threat. Enki, ever the strategist, often used diplomacy as a tool of war, negotiating agreements with the intent of creating openings or gaining crucial intelligence. Enlil, in contrast, preferred direct confrontation, viewing negotiation as a sign of weakness. These opposing philosophies amplified the intensity and unpredictability of the conflict, making each encounter potentially decisive. One critical turning point during this phase was the capture of the Tablets of Destiny, artifacts said to contain knowledge and control over the natural and cosmic order. Control of these tablets could grant an Anunnaki unparalleled power over both mortals and gods. Enlil initially secured the tablets during a surprise assault on one of Enki's forward bases. Yet through cunning deception, Enki managed to recover them, using both human intermediaries and secret Anunnaki allies. The struggle over these artifacts symbolized the broader war, a contest not only of strength but of intellect, foresight, and adaptability. By the end of this initial phase, it became clear that the Anunnaki civil war would not be brief. Unlike mortal conflicts, where battles and seasons could resolve disputes, this war was prolonged, with each side leveraging superior knowledge, power, and cunning. Human civilization, caught in the crossfire, began to transform under these pressures. Cities became fortified centers of both survival and strategy. Technologies advanced rapidly, as humans received gifts of knowledge either as rewards or necessities imposed by the gods. Early agriculture, metallurgy, and astronomy all flourished under the shadow of this divine conflict, suggesting that much of humanity's rapid progress may have been a byproduct of the war itself. As Part 2 closes, the first major battles have set a precedent. The Anunnaki civil war is no longer theoretical or distant. It is a tangible force, reshaping both the divine hierarchy and human civilization. The clash between Enlil and Enki, between domination and collaboration, has introduced a pattern of escalation, deception, and innovation that will characterize the ensuing centuries. The war has begun to change the face of the earth, leaving its marks not only in myth and memory but in the very soil, rivers, and mountains that humans would inherit. The stage is now set for the next phase. The war expands beyond Mesopotamia, drawing in additional gods, spreading to other regions of the earth, and entangling humanity in increasingly complex ways. The question looms: will the Anunnaki find resolution, or will their conflict escalate to a point of no return, threatening the world itself? The escalation, factions, betrayal, and cataclysm. The first clashes in southern Mesopotamia were only the beginning. The ideological rift that divided Enlil and Enki was mirrored among other members of the Anunnaki pantheon, fracturing an already volatile hierarchy. As the war intensified, new alliances formed, some out of conviction, others out of self-preservation. Each faction brought with it unique powers, strategic visions, and ambitions that would forever alter the trajectory of life on Earth. Nergal, previously a loyal lieutenant to Enlil, began asserting his own influence. Known as the god of war and the underworld, Nergal had long desired dominion over mortal life and death. Observing the conflict, he realized that aligning strictly with Enlil could limit his opportunities for expansion. Secretly, he began building independent forces and stockpiling resources in the mountains and deserts, where humans were already laboring under his supervision. His cities were fortified, his warriors trained in ways that would rival even the mightiest of the Anunnaki. The duplicity of Nergal would soon make him a critical player, capable of tipping the balance of the war in unforeseen ways. Meanwhile, Ninhursag, goddess of life and fertility, actively supported Enki, not merely for philosophical reasons but for survival. She foresaw that the destruction wrought by Enlil's faction could annihilate humanity entirely if unchecked. By secretly guiding humans in agriculture, medicine, and city building, she ensured that they could withstand both environmental upheaval and military assault. These humans became her proxies on the battlefield, ingeniously applying knowledge that would seem miraculous to their contemporaries. In doing so, Ninhursag blurred the line between god and mortal, creating agents capable of influencing the war's outcome in ways even the Anunnaki had not anticipated. The escalation was marked by increasingly sophisticated strategies. Enlil, frustrated by repeated setbacks in direct assaults on Enki's bastions, began employing scorched earth tactics. Entire river systems were manipulated to drown fertile lands, while earthquakes and lightning storms, weapons of divine origin, reshaped landscapes, forcing human populations to migrate. The war was no longer limited to battlefields, it became an environmental catastrophe, altering climates, eroding ecosystems, and reshaping coastlines. This period coincides suspiciously with geological anomalies observed in sedimentary layers, sudden flooding, unexplained seismic activity, and shifts in flora and fauna that cannot be fully explained by natural processes alone. Enki responded with ingenuity. Utilizing both his knowledge of Earth's natural systems and the loyalty of human engineers, he created sanctuaries that withstood Enlil's assaults. Humans were instructed to construct canals, dams, and fortified cities capable of channeling floods and withstanding storms, effectively turning the environment into a defensive mechanism. This symbiosis between humans and gods exemplifies the unique dynamics of the war, mortal ingenuity amplified by divine guidance, creating a civilization more resilient and advanced than it otherwise would have been. The first large-scale cataclysm occurred during a confrontation near the Zagros Mountains. Enlil, seeking to crush Enki's influence in the northern territories, unleashed a storm of unprecedented intensity. Rivers swelled beyond their banks, avalanches buried valleys, and the skies rained fire, celestial phenomena that would later be interpreted in myth as divine wrath. Enki's forces, aided by human ingenuity and strategic foresight, diverted some rivers and fortified key cities, saving lives but failing to prevent widespread destruction. Tens of thousands of humans perished, entire forests were incinerated, and fertile plains were rendered barren. This cataclysm was the first of many, demonstrating that the Anunnaki civil war had consequences far beyond political or ideological disputes. It had the potential to reshape the very surface of the planet. Amidst these catastrophes, espionage and betrayal became tools as vital as physical force. Agents of Enki infiltrated Enlil's councils, sabotaging supply lines and redirecting weapons. Conversely, Enlil's spies spread misinformation among Enki's human allies, creating confusion and panic. The war became a blend of brute force, strategy, and psychological manipulation, with each side seeking to exploit the weaknesses of the other in ways both subtle and devastating. It was during this period that the use of human proxies became a defining feature of the conflict. Entire settlements were trained not only in survival but in tactical warfare. Humans learned to wield tools, construct fortifications, and anticipate the movements of divine forces. Some were elevated to semi-divine status, gifted with extended lifespans, knowledge of astronomy, and the ability to manipulate primitive forms of energy. These human agents became pivotal in battles, acting as scouts, engineers, and strategists. Ancient myths that speak of heroes and demigods may well be records of these human participants, mortals who walked the line between God and man during the Civil War. The widening scope of the war drew additional Anunnaki into the fray. Figures such as Ishku, god of storms, and Utu, god of justice and sun, aligned with various factions, their allegiances dictated by ideology, personal ambition, or calculated advantage. Ishku's storms wreaked havoc on agriculture, punishing humans for perceived loyalties. Utu's interventions, on the other hand, sought to protect certain regions, creating pockets of stability amid chaos. The interplay between these factions created a complex theater of war, with shifting battle lines and unpredictable outcomes. It became evident that the Anunnaki civil war was no longer a regional struggle. It had expanded across continents, drawing in humans and reshaping the environment on a massive scale. Cities were abandoned or fortified, rivers and mountains were manipulated as tools of war, humans gained knowledge and power previously unimaginable. The stage was set for even greater conflicts, battles that would leave lasting scars on the earth, disrupt the balance of nature, and challenge the very survival of both gods and mortals. The war had escalated beyond mere ideology. It was a cosmic contest for supremacy, survival, and control over the planet itself. What began as a philosophical schism between Enlil and Enki had now grown into a sprawling, multifaceted conflict with no clear end in sight. Humanity was no longer passive, it had become an integral player in a divine drama whose echoes would resonate through millennia. Global escalation, champions, uprisings, and the shaping of civilization. As the war between Enlil and Enki entered its next phase, the conflict no longer remained confined to the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia or the Zagros highlands. Its reach expanded across continents, propelled by both the mobility of the Anunnaki and the far-reaching consequences of their cataclysmic battles. Earth itself had become a theater of divine warfare, and humanity, whether willingly or unwillingly, found itself in the midst of a war that spanned oceans, mountains, and deserts. The escalation brought forward legendary figures among the Anunnaki, warriors, strategists, and tacticians whose exploits would later echo through myth and scripture. Among these was Ninurta, a son of Enlil, renowned for his ferocity and mastery of weaponry that could level cities. He led campaigns into northern territories, wielding technology so advanced it reshaped the very land. Humans witnessing his arrival described chariots of fire that moved across the plains with blinding speed, leaving rivers diverted and fields scorched. Ninurta's campaigns were as much psychological warfare as they were physical. The sight of his forces alone could compel cities to surrender. Opposing him was Marduk, a strategist and rising figure aligned with Enki's faction. Marduk's genius lay in his ability to coordinate humans and gods alike, combining ingenuity, espionage, and environmental manipulation to counter Ninurta's overwhelming force. In battles along the Tigris and Euphrates, Marduk would orchestrate ambushes that redirected floods or engineered defenses using the natural terrain, demonstrating that human knowledge and divine power together could match even the fiercest Anunnaki warrior. The confrontations between Ninurta and Marduk were not only battles of strength but of intellect, strategy, and foresight. As the war expanded, human populations began to rise in rebellion, influenced by the ongoing chaos and by Enki's encouragement. These were not mere riots but organized uprisings, sometimes coordinated across cities. Humans, empowered with knowledge and fortified settlements, began to resist the whims of their Anunnaki overlords. In some cases, these uprisings were brutally suppressed by Enlil's forces, leaving devastation in their wake. In other instances, they succeeded, providing strategic advantages to Enki's coalition and demonstrating that humanity was no longer just a tool, it had become a decisive factor in the civil war. Natural disasters, many of which were byproducts of the Anunnaki's battles, accelerated human adaptation. Floods, earthquakes, and sudden climate shifts forced communities to innovate. Canals and dams were built not just for agriculture but as defensive measures against divine warfare. Cities developed fortifications capable of withstanding forces that could rival godly attacks. The war inadvertently accelerated human civilization, giving rise to early engineering, urban planning, and social organization on a scale unprecedented in prehistory. This period may explain the rapid development of complex societies across multiple regions, a phenomenon that standard historical timelines struggle to account for. The war also introduced the concept of proxy warfare on a global scale. Anunnaki factions began competing for influence over distant regions by recruiting and empowering human intermediaries. In the Indus Valley, for instance, humans began constructing cities and infrastructure under guidance from emissaries of Enki, while Enlil's loyalists attempted to assert dominance through intimidation and raids. Across the Levant, Africa, and even parts of what would later be called Europe, humans were given varying degrees of knowledge, weapons, and leadership skills. The spread of culture, technology, and societal organization during this era may be directly linked to these divine interventions, as humans were effectively trained to become capable participants in a global war. The first truly global cataclysm occurred as a result of an open confrontation between Enlil and Enki themselves. Both deployed massive energy weapons of unknown origin, manipulating tectonic plates, weather systems, and oceans. The skies burned with auroral fires, mountains split, and massive tsunamis swept coastal regions. Survivors of these events would later recount them in myth as divine punishment or judgment, unaware that these were the consequences of a civil war between gods rather than natural phenomena. Ancient sites, from the ruins of the Indus Valley to submerged cities along the Persian Gulf, bear physical traces consistent with sudden, catastrophic upheavals during this period. Amid the chaos, smaller Anunnaki factions pursued their own agendas. Nergal, exploiting the conflict, attempted to establish dominion over isolated territories in Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, while Ishku's storms punished those who dared defy him. These actions forced both Enlil and Enki to divert attention, resulting in a series of multi-front battles that taxed both gods and humans alike. The complexity of these engagements created a war theater of unprecedented scale, where survival depended not only on strength but on intelligence, foresight, and adaptability. It was during this global phase that humans began recording history in earnest, not merely as a method of preservation but as a tool for survival. Cuneiform tablets, oral traditions, and pictographs began to reflect both the material and spiritual upheavals of the age. Humans chronicled divine battles, catastrophic floods, and heroic acts, often deifying mortal champions who played critical roles. The line between myth and reality blurred, as humanity attempted to comprehend events beyond mortal understanding. What we interpret as mythological epics, tales of hero gods, flood narratives, and cosmic wars may, in fact, be historical records of the Anunnaki civil war, encoded in the only language humans could yet use, story. Despite the devastation, pockets of civilization endured. Enki and his allies focused on preserving these hubs, reinforcing human settlements, and ensuring that knowledge would survive. These strongholds became centers of learning, experimentation, and innovation, laying the groundwork for future civilizations. Enlil's faction, relentless and aggressive, continued to exact punishment, reshaping territories and enforcing dominance where possible. This push and pull defined the global conflict, a cycle of destruction and reconstruction, loss and preservation, that would shape the destiny of Earth for millennia to come. The war had reached a scale that was both planetary and epoch-defining. The battles were no longer local skirmishes, they were cataclysmic events that determined the survival of human civilizations, reshaped the planet's geography, and elevated humanity from passive observers to active participants in a divine struggle. The Anunnaki civil war was no longer merely a theological or mythological concept, it was a tangible, reality-altering phenomenon, one whose echoes would persist through time. Legendary battles, heroes, cataclysms, and human survival. As the war entered its fifth phase, the scale of destruction and the magnitude of divine strategy reached levels unimaginable to mortals. Battles were no longer isolated incidents, they became epoch-defining events, reshaping landscapes, uprooting civilizations, and altering the trajectory of human history. The confrontation between Enlil and Enki, now amplified by loyalists and opportunists alike, produced legendary warriors, unprecedented tactics, and cataclysms whose effects would echo for millennia. One of the most pivotal encounters occurred in the region later known as the Levant. Enlil, determined to assert dominance over strategic territories rich in resources and labor, dispatched Ninurta and a legion of loyal Anunnaki. Their objective was to crush Enki's foothold and demonstrate the futility of resistance to his authority. In response, Enki deployed Marduk and Ninhursag, supported by human engineers and soldiers who had begun mastering early siege techniques and energy manipulation. What ensued was a battle chronicled in fragmented tablets as the Fire of the Two Suns, a confrontation where divine weaponry collided, mountains split, and rivers reversed course. Human settlements near the battlefield were destroyed, leaving survivors to wander and rebuild, unknowingly preserving fragments of knowledge for future generations. This battle illustrated a recurring theme of the Civil War, the paradoxical relationship between destruction and creation. While Enlil sought to obliterate resistance through overwhelming force, Enki's defensive strategies leveraged destruction as an opportunity for human empowerment. Fortified cities were rebuilt stronger, irrigation systems became more sophisticated, and humans learned to anticipate and survive environmental upheavals. Many of the technological and societal leaps recorded during this period, advanced metallurgy, organized urban planning, and astronomical observation, may be traced directly to these survival imperatives, turning human adaptation into a weapon of war itself. Meanwhile, Nergal exploited the chaos in peripheral regions to expand his influence. In the deserts of what is now the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa, he established fortified settlements, controlling key trade routes and mining operations. Unlike Enlil or Enki, whose conflict was driven by ideology, Nergal's campaigns were opportunistic, focused on accumulation of power and wealth. His forces, both divine and human, employed scorched earth tactics that devastated local ecosystems and displaced populations. These campaigns, though secondary in the larger narrative, played a critical role in spreading the war across continents and drawing previously neutral Anunnaki into the conflict. The human dimension of the war became increasingly pronounced. Civilizations in Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Indus Valley were caught between divine armies, forced to choose sides or face annihilation. In some cases, entire populations were relocated, guided by Enki's faction to establish new centers of civilization in safer territories. These migrations led to the foundation of cities whose names and ruins persist in archaeological records today. Humans were not merely victims, they became strategists, engineers, and scouts, wielding knowledge imparted by the gods to influence battles and preserve communities. Oral traditions later mythologized these acts, portraying humans as heroic figures, demigods, or chosen ones, reflecting the intertwining of mortal agency with divine conflict. Another legendary confrontation, known in myth as the Battle of the Twin Rivers, took place along the Tigris and Euphrates. Enlil sought to annihilate Enki's stronghold at Eridu, deploying destructive energy weapons capable of leveling fortifications and reshaping terrain. Enki, anticipating this assault, employed a combination of human ingenuity and environmental manipulation. Canals were redirected to create floods that neutralized Enlil's advance, while human-built fortifications absorbed energy blasts that might have destroyed entire cities. The battle lasted for weeks, leaving the landscape scarred and the human population traumatized, yet it marked a turning point. Humans were beginning to influence the outcome of conflicts once determined solely by gods. These battles also highlighted the emergence of specialized Anunnaki warriors. Ninurta, Marduk, Ishku, and Ninhursag became more than mere generals. They embodied tactical doctrines, wielding powers and strategies that could alter geography, climate, and human society. Ninurta's assaults demonstrated the raw destructive power of the Anunnaki. Marduk's strategies emphasized adaptability and human collaboration. Ishka controlled weather to destabilize regions, and Ninhursag protected life, ensuring continuity amid devastation. Each battle became a lesson in the interplay between divine might, strategy, and human survival. The environmental consequences of these conflicts were profound. Mountains were split, rivers redirected, and coastlines altered by the use of energy weapons and tectonic manipulation. Archaeological evidence suggests abrupt climatic events and massive floods occurred during this period, which may correspond to these battles. Human populations were forced to adapt rapidly, developing early warning systems, fortified settlements, and advanced agricultural practices. Survival was no longer guaranteed by proximity to fertile land. It required knowledge, ingenuity, and alignment with a faction of the gods. Despite the devastation, pockets of human civilization endured and thrived under the guidance of Enki and Ninhursag. Knowledge was preserved, cultivated, and passed down, giving rise to advanced urban centers, trade networks, and early scientific understanding. Some humans became semi-divine, elevated in status, longevity, and wisdom, serving as intermediaries between gods and mortals. These human champions would later be immortalized in myths and epics, their deeds serving as reminders of humanity's critical role in the Anunnaki civil war. The civil war had reached a scale that redefined the relationship between gods and mortals. Battles were no longer confined to limited regions, they spanned continents and reshaped ecosystems. Humans were no longer passive observers but active participants, their survival and ingenuity influencing outcomes and altering the course of divine conflict. Legendary warriors of the Anunnaki had emerged, leaving indelible marks on the earth, its civilizations, and the collective memory of humanity. Betrayal and cataclysm, the hidden champions emerge. By the sixth phase of the Anunnaki civil war, the conflict had evolved far beyond the original ideological split between Enlil and Enki. Factions had multiplied, allegiances shifted, and the war had become as much about personal ambition and survival as it was about control of Earth. What had once been a struggle for ideological dominance had now transformed into a sprawling, complex conflict involving deception, espionage, and covert operations that would forever alter the balance of power. One of the most significant developments during this period was the emergence of hidden champions, Anunnaki warriors and strategists whose loyalty was fluid, whose tactics were unpredictable, and whose influence on the battlefield often turned the tide of war in unexpected ways. Among them was Namtar, a shadowy figure aligned initially with Enlil but secretly in communication with Enki. Namtar specialized in covert operations, using stealth and manipulation rather than open confrontation. Ancient tablets describe him orchestrating ambushes against Enlil's own forces, redirecting attacks, and sabotaging supply lines. His actions exemplified a growing trend. The war was no longer defined solely by brute force, intelligence, cunning, and secrecy had become decisive. Meanwhile, Enki's faction also saw the rise of new leaders who combined divine power with an intimate understanding of human potential. Gishtinana, goddess of destiny and fertility, coordinated with human leaders to establish fortified settlements capable of resisting the destructive might of Enlil's armies. Her approach emphasized preservation, using human ingenuity and natural terrain as a force multiplier. Humans under her guidance learned to anticipate Anunnaki strategies, reinforcing structures and creating emergency protocols that allowed communities to survive even the most catastrophic assaults. This period marked the first time humans were not merely pawns or laborious but co-strategists in the divine conflict. Betrayal became a defining feature of the war. Nergal, who had previously maintained an opportunistic stance, began openly challenging both Enlil and Enki, exploiting the chaos to establish his dominion. His forces, operating from fortified deserts and remote highlands, launched surprise attacks against supply depots and isolated settlements. Even Ninurta, Enlil's most fearsome warrior, faced unexpected reversals due to internal betrayal and sabotage orchestrated by Namtar and Marduk. Alliances shifted with alarming frequency, making it nearly impossible for any faction to maintain prolonged supremacy. Amidst this internal chaos, the war's environmental impact intensified. The Anunnaki wielded forces capable of reshaping landscapes on a continental scale. Mountains were fractured, rivers redirected, and coastlines transformed by energy discharges and tectonic manipulation. These actions generated natural disasters that compounded human suffering, including sudden floods, droughts, and seismic upheavals. The most catastrophic of these events, later recorded in myths as the Great Deluge, coincided with an attempt by Enlil to decisively eliminate Enki's northern strongholds. Enki's coalition, employing a combination of human ingenuity and divine intervention, managed to preserve life, but the widespread devastation left an indelible mark on the planet. The interplay between betrayal, cataclysm, and human resilience created a new dynamic in the Civil War. Humans were no longer passive victims of divine conflict, they had become active participants, learning to harness knowledge, construct fortifications, and anticipate Anunnaki tactics. Ancient records suggest that during this period, humans were granted gifts of literacy, mathematics, and early engineering, tools that enabled them to survive and even thrive amidst the chaos. Many of these advancements would later form the foundation of early civilizations, suggesting that the Anunnaki War indirectly accelerated human development. Not all Anunnaki engaged directly in combat. Some, like Utu, god of the sun and justice, sought to mediate disputes, protect human populations, and enforce temporary truces. Others, like Ishku, exploited the conflict to consolidate their own power, using storms and weather manipulation to punish regions resisting their influence. These diverse approaches further complicated the battlefield, creating zones of intense conflict, fragile stability, and human innovation. One pivotal moment in this phase involved the Battle of the Twin Peaks, where Enlil's forces attempted a full-scale assault on an Enki stronghold strategically positioned along two mountain ranges. Enki's hidden champions, including Marduk and Geshtinana, executed a sophisticated strategy, diverting rivers, triggering controlled landslides, and using human-built fortifications to counter Enlil's superior firepower. The battle lasted weeks, leaving the mountains scarred and entire valleys uninhabitable. Humans who survived these cataclysms became living witnesses to divine warfare, their stories preserved in oral traditions and early records, often mythologized as heroic epics. Several key patterns had emerged. The Civil War was no longer purely ideological. Betrayal, cunning, and intelligence had become as important as strength. Humans were evolving from passive laborious into co-strategists and survivors, learning to influence outcomes in ways previously unimaginable. The Earth itself bore the scars of this divine conflict, reshaped landscapes, altered rivers, and cataclysmic events serving as both evidence and warning of the war's intensity. Decisive confrontations, humans as pawns and players. By the seventh phase of the Anunnaki Civil War, the struggle had reached a scale that blurred the lines between myth, history, and reality. Entire regions were now battlefields, scarred by divine weaponry and cataclysmic energy. Human civilizations, long subordinate to the whims of the gods, had become central to the conflict. They were no longer mere pawns. In many ways, their ingenuity, loyalty, and survival determined the outcomes of battles between the Anunnaki factions. One of the most critical theaters of this period was the plains of Shuruppak, a fertile region along the lower Tigris River. Enlil, seeking to crush the remaining strongholds of Enki's allies, deployed Ninurta, Nergal, and a coalition of lesser Anunnaki generals. The goal was not simply military conquest but a complete reordering of divine authority on Earth. Human settlements loyal to Enki had been fortified under the guidance of Geshtinana and Marduk, equipped with both structural defenses and tactical knowledge that allowed them to resist even the most devastating assaults. The battle was cataclysmic. Ninurta's forces unleashed energy weapons that vaporized forests, redirected rivers, and shattered mountainsides. Nergal's armies used scorched earth tactics, destroying food supplies and forcing humans to flee. Yet Enki's strategies proved remarkably effective. Floodwaters were diverted to create natural barriers, fortifications absorbed energy blasts, and human engineers implemented rapid repairs to critical infrastructure. Observers of this era, writing centuries later, would describe these events as gods warring with fire and storm, unaware that humans played a decisive, strategic role in mitigating destruction. Amid the chaos, the role of secret champions became increasingly apparent. Namtar and other covert operatives orchestrated ambushes against Enlil's supply lines, disrupting the coordination of the invading forces. These operations demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of logistics and strategy, suggesting that the war was as much about intelligence and subterfuge as it was about raw power. For the first time, the outcomes of key battles depended on the clever manipulation of resources, terrain, and human allies rather than sheer force alone. The human dimension of the war continued to expand. Populations were relocated, trained in defensive construction, and given knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, and astronomy to support strategic objectives. Some humans were elevated to semi-divine status, becoming intermediaries who could communicate directly with the gods and coordinate battlefield strategies. This elevation not only strengthened Enki's faction but also laid the foundation for early city-states and civilizations. The rapid dissemination of knowledge during this period may explain the sudden advancements in urban planning, writing, and complex societies observed in the archaeological record. A particularly significant confrontation, later mythologized as the Battle of the Twin Seas, involved simultaneous engagements along two major river systems. Enlil sought to overwhelm Enki's positions by dividing forces and attacking from multiple directions. Enki countered by orchestrating a synchronized defense using both human fortifications and environmental manipulation. Canals were redirected, levees reinforced, and floodwaters strategically released to create barriers. This battle demonstrated the evolving nature of warfare. Humans were now active participants, their knowledge and labor critical to survival and success. During this phase, the war's environmental impact intensified dramatically. Energy weapons, tectonic manipulation, and redirection of rivers caused widespread devastation. Regions once fertile became barren, coastlines shifted, and entire populations were displaced. Some of these events would later be memorialized in myths as divine punishment or the wrath of gods, while others were recorded as foundational stories of survival, leadership, and heroism. The Civil War had begun to leave a permanent mark on Earth itself, shaping ecosystems, river courses, and human settlement patterns that persist to this day. Internal strife within factions became more pronounced as well. Nergal, dissatisfied with Enlil's leadership and eager to consolidate power, began undermining his allies, seizing key territories and resources for his own purposes. Ishkur, wielding control over storms and weather, shifted allegiances to exploit strategic advantages. These betrayals forced both Enlil and Enki to continuously adapt, emphasizing the importance of intelligence, loyalty, and foresight. The Civil War had evolved into a multi-layered conflict where even gods were vulnerable to treachery and miscalculation. Several key realities were evident. The Civil War had transformed the Earth, leaving deep scars on its landscape and reshaping human civilization. Humans had emerged as strategic actors, no longer passive observers but critical participants in battles that would determine the future of both mortals and gods. The war was no longer a straightforward ideological struggle, it had become a complex, multifactional conflict defined by betrayal, intelligence, and the interplay between divine power and human ingenuity. Global cataclysm, human fortresses, and planetary upheaval. By the eighth phase of the Anunnaki Civil War, the conflict had escalated to a planetary scale. What began as a regional ideological struggle had transformed into a global confrontation that involved multiple Anunnaki factions, human populations, and the very forces of nature itself. The battlefield was no longer limited to Mesopotamia or the Fertile Crescent, it had spread across continents, seas, and mountain ranges. Humanity, once passive observers of divine power, had become central players in strategies that would determine survival and the future of civilization. The escalation began with simultaneous campaigns across multiple regions. Enlil, frustrated by repeated setbacks, mobilized his forces with unprecedented ferocity. Ninurta, his most fearsome general, led coordinated attacks in the north while Nergal advanced through desert and coastal regions to cut off Enki's supply lines. The primary objective was to crush human strongholds and secure territories rich in resources essential to the Anunnaki. Energy weapons capable of altering landscapes were deployed on a massive scale, mountains were shattered, rivers redirected, and entire plains flattened. Human settlements that resisted faced complete annihilation. In response, Enki, aided by Marduk, Ninhursag, and a network of human engineers and strategists, implemented global defensive strategies. Fortified cities were constructed in locations chosen for both natural protection and strategic advantage. Canals and rivers were redirected to create barriers against advancing forces. Elevated terraces and walled cities allowed human defenders to survive bombardments that would have otherwise destroyed unprepared settlements. The synergy between human ingenuity and divine guidance transformed select cities into bastions capable of withstanding even the mightiest assaults of Enlil's forces. One of the most significant confrontations of this phase occurred along the Indus Valley, a region that became a critical stronghold for Enki's faction. Enlil's forces sought to assert control over its rich resources and strategic position. Marduk, anticipating the attack, orchestrated a sophisticated defense involving human-built fortifications, redirection of waterways, and tactical deployment of elite human warriors. The resulting battle was catastrophic. Floods reshaped the valley, fortresses absorbed energy blasts, and rivers became strategic tools for both offense and defense. Survivors documented the events in myths and epics, portraying them as divine battles or floods sent by the gods, though they were the direct result of Anunnaki conflict. Across other regions, similar patterns emerged. In the Levant and North Africa, human populations were relocated to fortified settlements guided by Enki and Ninhursag. These strongholds became centers of resistance, innovation, and cultural preservation. Humans learned to manipulate the terrain, construct advanced defensive works, and anticipate divine assaults. The knowledge disseminated during this period, including agriculture, urban planning, metallurgy, and astronomy, laid the foundation for early civilizations and reflected the unprecedented influence of the Civil War on human development. The war's environmental impact intensified dramatically during this phase. Energy weapons and tectonic manipulation triggered earthquakes, volcanic activity, and massive floods. Entire river systems were altered, coastlines shifted, and fertile plains were rendered barren. Geological records suggest abrupt climate changes and sudden ecological disruptions consistent with cataclysmic events described in myths from multiple cultures. These disasters were not random, they were byproducts of battles between gods wielding energy on a planetary scale. Humanity's survival depended on rapid adaptation, fortification, and guidance from the faction aligned with Enki, who prioritized preservation of life. The role of secret champions became even more pronounced. Namtar and other covert operatives continued to sabotage supply lines, redirect forces, and orchestrate ambushes that turned the tide of critical battles. Marduk coordinated with human intermediaries to implement advanced strategies that leveraged environmental conditions to neutralize Enlil's superior firepower. These operations demonstrated the growing importance of intelligence, strategy, and human collaboration in determining the outcome of divine warfare. This period also witnessed a dramatic expansion of human influence. Entire cities became hubs of knowledge and resistance. Humans learned to forecast divine movements by observing patterns in the environment, astronomy, and even the behavior of the gods themselves. Semi-divine humans acted as intermediaries, communicating tactics, coordinating defenses, and managing resources on a scale that rivaled the logistical capabilities of the Anunnaki themselves. This unprecedented human agency fundamentally altered the dynamics of the war, blurring the line between mortal and divine. Despite the devastation, both sides recognized the strategic necessity of controlling human populations. Enlil sought to subjugate humans as laborious and tools for resource extraction, while Enki aimed to preserve them as allies, engineers, and warriors. This ideological divide was central to the conflict. One side valued dominance through fear, the other survival through empowerment. Human settlements became chess pieces in a war that spanned continents, with every relocation, fortification, and technological advancement carrying profound consequences. The Anunnaki civil war had become a fully global phenomenon. The Earth itself bore the scars of divine warfare, altered landscapes, shifted rivers, and catastrophic natural events that reshaped human civilization. Humans had evolved into critical actors, capable of influencing outcomes through ingenuity, strategic planning, and alliance with their chosen deities. The balance of power was no longer determined solely by strength. Intelligence, adaptability, and human collaboration had become decisive factors in a conflict that threatened to consume the planet. Climactic confrontations, humanity on the brink. By the ninth phase of the Anunnaki civil war, the Earth was a fractured arena, scarred by centuries of divine conflict. Rivers had changed course, mountains bore deep fissures, and entire regions had been abandoned or destroyed. Humanity, caught in the middle of this cosmic struggle, teetered on the brink of annihilation. The ideological schism that had begun between Enlil and Enki had expanded to encompass a multifaceted conflict among multiple factions, each seeking supremacy. The stage was set for climactic confrontations that would decide the fate of both gods and mortals. Enlil, frustrated by the repeated failures of direct assaults, devised a massive campaign aimed at overwhelming Enki's remaining strongholds. Ninurta, Ishku, and Nergal led a coordinated assault spanning Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Indus Valley. The strategy was simple but brutal: destroy fortified cities, redirect rivers to flood human settlements aligned with Enki, and annihilate any human or Anunnaki force that resisted. These operations unleashed energy on a planetary scale, causing earthquakes, floods, and storms that reshaped entire regions. Enki, anticipating the magnitude of this offensive, coordinated a global network of defenses with both human and divine allies. Fortified cities acted as strategic nodes, canals, and rivers were manipulated to slow Enlil's advance, and elite human warriors served as scouts, engineers, and tactical coordinators. Marduk, Gishtinana, and Ninhursag implemented defensive strategies that leveraged the terrain, environmental patterns, and human ingenuity to counter the destructive power of Enlil's forces. The result was a series of battles where survival depended as much on intellect and planning as on raw power. One of the most legendary confrontations of this phase occurred along the Tigris and Euphrates, known in later myth as the Battle of the Twin Rivers. Enlil's forces advanced in overwhelming numbers, but Enki's defenders redirected floodwaters to create natural barriers, while fortifications absorbed energy blasts capable of leveling entire cities. Humans, elevated to semi-divine status, played a critical role in coordinating defenses, repairing breaches, and executing counterattacks. The battle lasted weeks, leaving the landscape scarred and entire populations traumatized, yet it marked a pivotal turning point. Humanity had become an indispensable force in determining the outcome of the war. Nergal's opportunism further complicated the conflict. Exploiting weakened regions and fractured alliances, he captured key territories in Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. While his objectives were self-serving, they inadvertently forced both Enlil and Enki to divert forces, creating openings that allowed human settlements to survive and expand. Ishku's control of storms and weather created additional chaos, punishing regions indiscriminately but also providing strategic advantages for those aligned with Enki. The interplay of ambition, strategy, and environmental manipulation made each confrontation unpredictable and deadly. The near collapse of human civilizations during this phase was stark. Entire cities were abandoned, agricultural systems destroyed, and populations displaced. Survivors migrated to fortified strongholds, often guided by semi-divine human intermediaries who had learned to anticipate divine strategies. These migrations contributed to the dissemination of knowledge, technology, and cultural practices, laying the foundation for future civilizations while simultaneously reflecting the immense toll of the war. The climactic phase also highlighted the importance of intelligence and covert operations. Namtar, Marduk, and other hidden champions orchestrated sabotage and ambushes that undermined Enlil's campaigns. By disrupting supply lines, manipulating battlefield conditions, and exploiting internal divisions among Enlil's generals, these secret agents were able to turn seemingly hopeless situations into tactical victories. The war had evolved into a complex chess match, with each side maneuvering both openly and behind the scenes, using humans as both pawns and players. Environmental cataclysms reached unprecedented levels. Rivers overflowed, mountains fractured, and coastal regions were submerged by tidal surges caused by divine energy manipulation. These events would later be memorialized in myths as divine punishment, floods, and wrath of the gods, yet they were the direct consequences of strategic warfare between Anunnaki factions. Human populations, forced to adapt rapidly, developed early systems of warning, emergency fortification, and communal governance that reflected both divine guidance and hard-won survival experience. The near collapse of human civilizations during this phase was stark. Entire cities were abandoned, agricultural systems destroyed, and populations displaced. Survivors migrated to fortified strongholds, often guided by semi-divine human intermediaries who had learned to anticipate divine strategies. These migrations contributed to the dissemination of knowledge, technology, and cultural practices, laying the foundation for future civilizations while simultaneously reflecting the immense toll of the war. The climactic phase also highlighted the importance of intelligence and covert operations. Namtar, Marduk, and other hidden champions orchestrated sabotage and ambushes that undermined Enlil's campaigns. By disrupting supply lines, manipulating battlefield conditions, and exploiting internal divisions among Enlil's generals, these secret agents were able to turn seemingly hopeless situations into tactical victories. The war had evolved into a complex chess match, with each side maneuvering both openly and behind the scenes, using humans as both pawns and players. Environmental cataclysms reached unprecedented levels. Rivers overflowed, mountains fractured, and coastal regions were submerged by tidal surges caused by divine energy manipulation. These events would later be memorialized in myths as divine punishment, floods, and wrath of the gods, yet they were the direct consequences of strategic warfare between Anunnaki factions. Human populations, forced to adapt rapidly, developed early systems of warning, emergency fortification, and communal governance that reflected both divine guidance and hard-won survival experience. The final battles: power, devastation, and a new world. By the 10th phase of the Anunnaki Civil War, the Earth had become a planet of extremes. Vast regions lay in ruin, cities were abandoned or fortified beyond recognition, and human populations were concentrated in strongholds guided by Enki and his allies. The war had evolved from ideological conflict into a struggle for absolute dominance, survival, and control of Earth's resources. It was a period defined by catastrophic battles, strategic brilliance, and the emergence of both divine and mortal heroes whose actions would shape the course of history. Enlil, determined to bring the war to a decisive conclusion, launched his most ambitious campaign yet. Ninurta led a massive strike force targeting the last major bastions of Enki-aligned humans and Anunnaki supporters across Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. Nergal, ever the opportunist, seized additional territories in Africa and Arabia, further complicating the strategic map. The intensity of these confrontations was unprecedented. Rivers were redirected with deadly precision, mountains were fractured to create impassable barriers, and storms and earthquakes were manipulated to devastate entire regions. Enki, anticipating Enlil's grand offensive, implemented a complex, multi-tiered defense. Marduk and Ninhursag coordinated human and divine forces across multiple theaters of war, employing environmental manipulation, fortified cities, and guerrilla tactics. Human engineers and strategists were critical in implementing defenses, maintaining supply lines, and coordinating counterattacks. Semi-divine humans acted as liaisons between gods and mortals, communicating tactical information and executing strategies that could neutralize the overwhelming firepower of Enlil's forces. One of the most decisive confrontations occurred in the region later known as the Zagros and Taurus Mountains. Enlil sought to annihilate Enki's last northern stronghold, deploying Ninurta and Ishkur in coordinated assaults. The defenders, guided by Enki and Marduk, diverted rivers to create flooding traps, triggered controlled landslides, and utilized human-built fortifications to absorb divine energy blasts. The battle lasted weeks, leaving mountains scarred, valleys submerged, and human populations displaced yet resilient. Survivors would later recount these events as epic myths of divine battles and floods, unaware that they were witnessing history shaped by both gods and mortals. Nergal's forces, meanwhile, clashed with both Enlil and Enki factions, seizing key territories and exploiting the chaos for personal gain. His opportunism highlighted a critical aspect of the war: even among gods, ambition and self-interest could alter strategic outcomes. Internal betrayal, shifting alliances, and unpredictable maneuvers made the war a complex and multi-layered conflict, where loyalty was uncertain and the balance of power could shift in a single battle. The human role reached its apex during this phase. Populations concentrated in fortified cities not only survived but actively influenced the course of battles. Knowledge of engineering, agriculture, and early forms of logistics allowed humans to reinforce cities, divert natural disasters, and coordinate supply chains for both mortal and divine allies. Semi-divine humans acted as generals, scouts, and engineers, bridging the gap between godly strategy and practical implementation. This unprecedented integration of human agency into divine warfare ensured the survival of civilizations that might otherwise have been obliterated. Environmental cataclysms intensified further. Massive floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and climate shifts occurred as a direct consequence of battles involving divine energy manipulation. Entire river systems were permanently altered, coastlines reshaped, and fertile lands rendered barren. These cataclysms were later immortalized in myths, legends, and religious texts as divine punishment, judgment, or wrath. In reality, they were strategic tools and unavoidable byproducts of the war, demonstrating the immense scale and power wielded by the Anunnaki. By the end of these final confrontations, the balance of power had shifted. Enlil's faction, while still formidable, had suffered significant losses due to strategic sabotage, environmental countermeasures, and the ingenuity of human collaborators. Enki's coalition, supported by semi-divine humans and environmental manipulation, preserved critical strongholds and maintained influence over key regions. Nergal retained control over opportunistic territories, ensuring that his influence would continue, albeit in a fragmented post-war landscape. Marks a turning point in the Anunnaki civil war. While no single faction achieved absolute dominance, a balance of power emerged. Human civilizations, having survived the devastation, were left in possession of knowledge, fortifications, and technologies imparted by the Anunnaki. The Earth itself bore permanent scars of the conflict: altered rivers, reshaped mountains, and regions rendered uninhabitable, yet also fortified centers of civilization that would become the cradle of future empires. In essence, the war had transformed the planet, humanity, and the divine hierarchy. Mortals had transitioned from passive laborers to indispensable participants in divine warfare. The Anunnaki, despite their power, had learned the limits of brute force and the necessity of strategy, alliances, and adaptation. The stage was set for the post-war world, where survivors, both human and divine, would inherit a planet forever changed by the conflict. Aftermath and enduring legacy: a world forever transformed. The Anunnaki Civil War, which had raged across millennia and spanned continents, finally drew to a close. The Earth itself bore the permanent scars of these divine conflicts. Rivers had been redirected by the energies unleashed in battle, mountains split and reshaped by divine might, and coastlines were transformed by the cataclysmic interventions of gods. Fertile valleys had been destroyed, while cities had been abandoned or rebuilt countless times under the guidance of both humans and divine allies. Entire ecosystems had been altered, forcing human populations to adapt rapidly or face extinction. Yet, despite this unimaginable devastation, life endured, and from this destruction emerged a new world order shaped equally by the Anunnaki and humanity. Enki's faction, which had championed the preservation of humans, focused on rebuilding and stabilizing the surviving civilizations. Under his guidance, the semi-divine humans, those who had served as intermediaries, strategists, and engineers during the conflict, played a critical role in restoring infrastructure, cultivating crops, and fortifying cities against future calamities. Canals were reconstructed, fortified walls reinforced, and urban layouts redesigned for maximum resilience. Human ingenuity, honed in the crucible of divine war, became a decisive force in shaping the emerging civilization. Knowledge that had once been used to manipulate rivers or construct siege weapons was now repurposed to create thriving, sustainable cities. Enlil's faction, though diminished in power by strategic defeats and internal betrayal, retained control over core territories. His approach shifted from unrestrained conquest to governance and oversight, prioritizing the stabilization of regions under his dominion. Ninurta, Ishku, and other loyal generals focused on maintaining order, while avoiding the large-scale conflicts that had previously devastated the planet. Even Enlil, the architect of much of the war's destruction, recognized the limits of brute force. The lessons of the Civil War had become clear: without cooperation, foresight, and the inclusion of human agency, absolute power could be challenged and even resisted. Nergal and other opportunistic deities maintained autonomous regions, exploiting the fragmented post-war landscape. Though often at odds with both Enki and Enlil, these gods played a role in shaping the new balance of power. Their presence ensured that no single faction could dominate entirely, creating a fragile equilibrium. The lessons of ambition, betrayal, and opportunism were written into the very fabric of this new order, both among the Anunnaki and within the human populations who had survived the war. Humans, perhaps more than any other participant in the conflict, were transformed by the events of the Civil War. Survivors had been exposed to knowledge, technologies, and strategies imparted by the gods, ranging from advanced agricultural techniques to engineering, astronomy, and early systems of governance. Semi-divine humans, who had served as advisors and intermediaries, became leaders in their communities, codifying knowledge and passing it on to future generations. The experiences of survival, adaptation, and strategic collaboration with divine powers became embedded in human culture, forming the foundation for myths, legends, and religious traditions that would endure for millennia. The cataclysmic events of the war, floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and climate disruptions, had left indelible marks on the planet. Entire regions that had once been fertile were rendered uninhabitable, forcing populations to migrate to new centers of civilization. The survivors brought with them the accumulated knowledge of warfare, engineering, and survival, enabling the rapid reconstruction of society in safer locations. This migration facilitated the dissemination of culture, technology, and religion, linking distant regions through shared knowledge and collective memory of the divine conflict. The war also fundamentally altered the relationship between humans and the Anunnaki. Once perceived as distant overlords, the gods had been forced to recognize the indispensability of human cooperation. Humans had evolved from passive laborious into active participants in divine strategy, capable of influencing outcomes, shaping battles, and preserving civilization. This shift in agency marked a turning point in the cosmic hierarchy. Mortality and divinity were now interdependent, and survival required collaboration, foresight, and mutual respect. The myths and legends that emerged from this period often portrayed humans as heroes, demigods, or chosen ones, reflecting the profound impact of their participation in divine affairs. Tales of floods, epic battles, and divine wrath, later immortalized in the stories of Noah, Gilgamesh, and Marduk, were grounded in the real experiences of human communities during the war. These narratives encoded knowledge of survival, strategy, and environmental manipulation, preserving lessons for future generations. Temples, ziggurats, and sacred sites were not only centers of worship but also repositories of knowledge, built upon locations that had been critical in the survival of civilizations during the war. The restructuring of the Anunnaki hierarchy reflected the lessons learned from centuries of conflict. Enki emphasized stewardship, preservation, and collaboration, ensuring that human knowledge and civilization were protected. Enlil, tempered by defeat and the demonstrated power of strategy over brute force, focused on governance and oversight, controlling territories while avoiding unnecessary destruction. Opportunistic gods like Nergal maintained independent spheres of influence, highlighting the enduring presence of ambition and self-interest. This new order reflected a delicate balance of power, a recognition that even gods were vulnerable to miscalculation, betrayal, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. The Earth itself, as a witness to the war, had been reshaped in ways that would influence humanity for millennia. Rivers altered by floods and divine intervention became central to agricultural development and the placement of cities. Mountains split or displaced by energy weapons became natural fortifications and landmarks. Fertile valleys that survived became centers of civilization, while barren wastelands served as cautionary reminders of the war's destructive power. Humanity inherited not only the physical remnants of this conflict but also the strategic knowledge required to survive and thrive in a world shaped by divine forces. Ultimately, the Anunnaki civil war was not simply a conflict between gods, it was a crucible that forged civilization itself. Human ingenuity, resilience, and strategic collaboration with the divine became essential tools for survival. Civilizations that endured were strengthened by knowledge, technological advancement, and the ability to adapt to environmental and political challenges. The war's legacy was embedded in both the physical world and the cultural memory of humanity, influencing religion, governance, and societal structure for generations to come. The war also left a moral and philosophical imprint. Humans learned that survival required not only strength but wisdom, collaboration, and foresight. Gods, in turn, were reminded of the limits of power and the necessity of strategic alliances. The relationship between mortality and divinity became more nuanced, reflecting the interdependence forged through centuries of conflict. This balance would shape the interactions between humans and gods in the eras that followed, laying the foundation for civilizations that revered the divine while exercising their own agency and ingenuity. In conclusion, the Anunnaki civil war forever transformed the planet, its inhabitants, and the divine order. Humans emerged as active participants in shaping history, elevated by knowledge, experience, and collaboration with semi-divine intermediaries. The Earth bore the permanent scars of cataclysmic battles, yet from the devastation arose resilience, ingenuity, and civilization. The war's lessons were encoded in myths, architecture, and cultural practices, serving as enduring reminders of the consequences of ambition, betrayal, and divine power. The wars of the Anunnaki were more than a story of destruction, they were a story of transformation, survival, and the enduring power of human agency. From chaos emerged knowledge, from devastation emerged civilization, and from conflict emerged a new balance between gods and mortals. The world that survived the Anunnaki civil war would carry forward these lessons, forever shaped by battles of unimaginable scale, the heroism of both humans and gods, and the enduring quest for survival, knowledge, and harmony in a cosmos defined by power and consequence. Even millennia later, the Earth itself, its civilizations, and its myths continue to whisper the memory of this war. Rivers flow along paths determined by ancient battles, mountains bear the marks of divine energy, and stories of gods and heroes endure as allegories, warnings, and guides. Humanity inherited not only survival but wisdom, knowledge, and the capacity to shape its destiny, lessons written in stone, water, and the stars themselves. The Anunnaki civil war had ended, but its legacy lived on, etched into the very foundation of human history, culture, and consciousness. It was a war that reshaped a world, elevated mortals to unprecedented importance, and forever changed the relationship between Earth, humanity, and the divine.